The Silver Dollar Saloon smelled the way Leadville always smelled in late October, of cheap whiskey, wet wool, and the particular desperation of men who had gambled their last season into the dirt. The piano in the corner was playing something that might have once been a hymn. Nobody was listening. "She's mute, ugly, and completely worthless." Josiah Crabtree said it the way a man announces the weather, flat, indifferent, utterly without shame. He pointed a shaking, tobacco-stained finger toward the shadows in the corner of the room, where a small figure sat huddled beneath an oversized wool coat several sizes too large for her frame. "But she can cook a stew and mend a shirt. And right now, gentlemen, that's all I got left to wager." Laughter rolled through the saloon like a wave, not the warm kind, the kind that has teeth. The figure in the corner did not move. She did not flinch at the laughter, did not raise her head when men craned their necks to look at her like she was livestock at an auction. Her face was entirely hidden beneath a ragged bonnet, smeared gray with ash and soot. Her hands, small, still, clutched a worn carpetbag to her chest as though it were the only solid thing left in the world. She was counting exits. She had counted them the moment she walked through the door. Old habit. Necessary habit. Front door, blocked by Crabtree's friend near the bar. Side window, nailed shut for winter. Back corridor past the barkeep. Possible, if she moved fast enough, if she could get past the man in the blue coat who kept glancing at Crabtree like he was owed something. She catalogued the room the way a general catalogues a battlefield. The problem with generals, of course, is that even the best ones sometimes run out of ground to retreat to. Crabtree's voice rose above the noise again. "Come on now, who wants her? She won't give you any trouble. She can't even tell you no." More laughter. The girl's fingers tightened on the carpetbag. She had been in worse rooms than this. She had survived worse men. She had learned, over 3 years of careful, deliberate invisibility, that the most dangerous thing she could do was react. Reaction was information. Reaction told a man he had found a nerve worth pressing. So she sat perfectly still. She breathed slowly. She did not exist. And then the room went quiet, not gradually, suddenly, as if someone had cut the sound with a knife. She risked a fraction of a glance upward through the shadow of her bonnet. A man had risen from the table at the back of the room. Not quickly, not dramatically. He simply stood up, and the space rearranged itself around him the way space does around things that are very large and very certain of themselves. He was dressed in buckskin and pine smoke, his beard heavy, his eyes the color of a bruised thundercloud. He looked like something the mountain had made, rather than something that had climbed it. He said something low and quiet to Crabtree. Crabtree's grin flickered. The girl looked back down at the floor. She did not allow herself to feel anything yet. She had felt things before in situations like this one. She had felt hope and gratitude, and the treacherous, stupid warmth of believing that someone was different. She had learned what hope cost, so she waited. She counted the exits again. And then the mountain man laid down his cards, and the Silver Dollar Saloon held its breath. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something simple. Right now, as you're listening to this story begin, what city are you in? Drop it below. I read every single one. Josiah Crabtree had found her in a Denver alley 17 months ago. She had been crouching behind a pile of wet newspaper, her dress soaked through, her hair matted against her face, her hands shaking from 3 days without food. He had looked at her the way a man looks at a stray dog. Not with cruelty exactly, but with the particular calculation of someone assessing whether a thing is useful enough to bother with. "You got a name?" he had asked. She had said nothing. Not because she couldn't, because she had already decided, in the fraction of a second it took to read his face, that silence was the only currency she had left that he couldn't steal. So Josiah Crabtree decided she was mute, and Josephine Whitmore let him believe it. She had been performing that silence for so long now that some mornings she woke up and had to remind herself that the voice was still there, still intact, still hers, waiting behind her teeth like a held breath. She was not ugly either. Beneath the carefully applied soot and ash, beneath the bonnet she never removed in public and the deliberate hunch she had trained into her shoulders, Josephine Whitmore possessed the kind of face that had once stopped conversations in Boston parlors. High cheekbones, a jaw that was delicate but firm, eyes so precisely, startlingly green that her mother had once laughed and called them a liability. "A woman with eyes like yours, Josephine, will never be able to lie convincingly." Her mother had been wrong about that. She had been lying convincingly for 3 years. The soot was strategic. The carpetbag, clutched always to her chest, always, contained not the meager possessions of a destitute ward, but a folded piece of thick parchment sealed in wax, a detailed geographic survey drawn in her father's precise engineer's hand, and a small, ivory-handled knife she had taken from the Sterling estate the night everything ended. She had walked out of that house through a library window while the sound of gunshots was still echoing off the mahogany walls. She had not looked back. Looking back was not something Josephine Whitmore permitted herself. Now she stood in the freezing air outside the Silver Dollar Saloon, the mountain man's broad back ahead of her as he moved through the crowd without looking to see if she followed. The Leadville night was savage, wind off the Sawatch Range, temperature dropping fast, the kind of cold that finds the gaps in your coat and presses in like a deliberate cruelty. She followed him, not because she trusted him. She did not trust him. She trusted no one, and she had excellent reasons for that, reasons written in blood on the parlor floor of a Denver estate, reasons that wore the names of men who had smiled at her father while planning his murder. She followed the mountain man because she had assessed the room, weighed her options with the cold precision of someone who had been doing exactly that for 3 years, and concluded that he was, at this particular moment, the least dangerous exit available to her. That was all. She watched the way he moved, unhurried, deliberate, a man who had not looked over his shoulder once since leaving the saloon. Either he was very foolish or very certain of himself. She had not yet decided which. He stopped at the stable, exchanged words with the keeper, and returned leading a roan gelding and a mule fitted with a new saddle. He had purchased the saddle. She registered that fact and filed it away without assigning it meaning. Men did kind things for reasons. The reasons were what mattered. She would find his reason eventually. She always did. "Mount up," he said. "It's a 3-day climb. Weather won't hold." She looked at him steadily from beneath the shadow of her bonnet. Then she took the mule's reins, not from his hand but from the post where he had tied them, and mounted without assistance, her movements clean and practiced. She saw his eyes register that. Good. Let him wonder. She pulled the bonnet lower and looked at the dark mountain rising above the town, enormous and indifferent and white with early snow. Somewhere in Denver, men were being paid to find her. Somewhere on that mountain, she calculated, there might be enough distance to think. She did not yet know that the man riding ahead of her had also come to this mountain to escape something. She did not yet know that the cabin waiting at the top of the trail would smell of cedar and old leather and become, against every instinct she possessed, the first place in 3 years that felt like it might, possibly, dangerously, be safe. She knew none of that yet. She only knew to keep her mouth shut, her eyes open, and her hand close to the ivory knife. There is an old question worth sitting with quietly tonight. It is easy to observe from a distance, to stay behind glass, to never let another person close enough to surprise you. But ask yourself honestly, is a life spent watching from the shadows truly living? Or is it the longest, loneliest kind of prison there is? The trail up Mount Massive did not ask for your opinion. It simply took from you. Your breath first, then your warmth, then the particular arrogance of anyone who believed they understood what cold truly meant before they had climbed above 9,000 feet in late October with the wind coming off the glacier like a drawn blade. Josephine gave it none of the satisfaction of showing how much it cost her. She rode the mule with her back straight and her chin level, the oversized wool coat buttoned to the throat, her gloved hands loose on the reins. She had ridden since she was 4 years old. Her father had insisted on it, not side saddle, not the decorative horsemanship of Boston finishing schools, but real riding, mountain trail riding, the kind that required balance and nerve and the willingness to trust an animal more than you trusted yourself on difficult ground. Another thing Josiah Crabtree had not known about her. The list was long. Layla Boone rode ahead without speaking. He had not spoken since they left the stable in Leadville, and Josephine found, somewhat to her own irritation, that his silence was not the silence of a man who had nothing to say. It was the silence of a man entirely comfortable inside himself, the silence of someone who did not require the constant noise of conversation to feel certain of his own existence. She was accustomed to being the one who withheld. She was not accustomed to being the one who observed. She observed him anyway. He read the trail the way her father had read survey maps, constantly, efficiently, with small adjustments that revealed deep familiarity. He angled Buster instinctively away from the windward side of an exposed ridge without breaking pace. He slowed before a narrow ice shelf without looking down at it, as though he had simply felt the change in the ground through the horse's stride. When a loose shelf of snow calved off a granite outcropping above the trail and skittered across their path with a hiss, the roan gelding barely flicked an ear. He had trained that horse on this mountain for years. She filed that away. The first night, they camped on a shelf of flat ground, sheltered by a stand of Engelmann spruce. Layla dismounted, tied the animals, and began unloading the pack mule with the efficient economy of someone who had done this 10,000 times and saw no reason to announce it. Josephine dismounted. She walked to the supply bundle, found the canvas tent, and began driving the iron pegs into the frozen ground with a flat river rock before he had finished unsaddling Buster. She felt him stop. She felt him watching. She kept driving pegs, her jaw set, her movements deliberate and quick. The kindling went in next. Dry spruce, she had noted on the pack mule, bundled separately from the rest of the supplies, which told her he planned his fires in advance and understood moisture in high-altitude timber. She stacked it in a tight pyramid over a base of dried birch bark and caught the first spark from his flint steel before it had a chance to fade. The fire took immediately. She sat back on her heels and looked at it. "You've camped before," he said. His voice was low and gravelly, the kind of voice that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his chest. It was not a question. She hunched her shoulders, dropped her gaze, let the competent woman fold back inside the performance of the broken ward, the way she always did when someone got too close to the edges of her. She heard him exhale, not frustrated, not suspicious, just quiet. He sat down across the fire from her, pulling a piece of hardtack from his coat and eating without ceremony. He did not push. He did not ask again. She ate her own portion in the shadow on her side of the fire and watched him through the veil of smoke and flame. The second day was harder. The trail narrowed to a ledge in places, the mountain falling away to the left in a sheer drop of several hundred feet, the white nothing of the valley floor far below obscured by low cloud. The wind picked up through the early afternoon, cutting sideways across the exposed sections with a force that made the mule plant its feet and shake its head. Josephine pressed her knees in and leaned forward, talking low against the animal's neck. Not words exactly, sounds. The particular rhythm of low, reassuring sound she had used with horses since childhood, inherited from a groom named Pell who had worked the Whitmore stables for 30 years and believed that animals understood intention better than language. It worked. The mule moved forward. She became aware, a moment later, that Layla had turned in his saddle and was looking back at her. She stopped making the sound. He turned back to the trail without comment. She did not know why that irritated her. That evening they descended into a protected hollow between two ridges, where the wind dropped to almost nothing, and the temperature, relatively, became something a person could survive without constant negotiation. A frozen stream ran along the hollow's floor, edged with ice that caught the last of the light in long blue-white fractures. Layla made camp. Josephine made the fire. They sat on opposite sides of it again, the silence between them different from the night before, less watchful, more settled. He heated water in a tin pot and added dried venison and what appeared to be wild thyme. The smell that lifted off it was simple and warm and cut through the altitude cold in a way that was almost embarrassingly comforting. He set a tin cup of the broth on the flat rock between them, on her side. He did not look at her when he did it. He did not wait for gratitude. She looked at the cup for a moment. She picked it up. The warmth moved through her hands and up into her wrists, and she permitted herself, privately, to close her eyes for exactly 3 seconds, and simply be warm. 3 seconds. That was all she allowed. Then she opened her eyes, straightened her spine, and looked back across the fire to find him already looking away, entirely occupied with his own cup, as if the small mercy he had just shown her was not worth remarking upon. She studied the side of his face in the firelight, the heavy jaw, the deep-set eyes, the particular stillness of a man who had learned long ago that the mountain would not accommodate drama. He was either very kind or very patient. She did not yet know which. She was beginning to think it might be both. That thought made her uncomfortable in a way she did not examine closely. On the evening of the third day, the tree line broke, and the trail leveled onto a wide, south-facing shelf of the mountain, and Josephine saw the cabin for the first time. It was low and solid, built from thick pine logs so precisely fitted that not even the highest mountain wind could find a seam worth exploiting. A stone chimney anchored the north wall. The roof was steeply pitched to shed snow. Whoever had built it had understood this mountain the way a person understands something they have decided to spend their life alongside. A faint thread of smoke still rose from the chimney. Banked coal, she realized. He had left a slow fire burning 3 days ago, knowing he would return to a cold that needed defeating immediately. He had planned for his own return. She stood in the doorway after he pushed it open, looking in at the firelight beginning to wake as he fed the banked coal, at the cedar smell and the spare, clean order of it, at the curtained sleeping alcove and the heavy table and the single rocking chair positioned at exactly the right angle from the fire. He had built this life deliberately, every detail of it chosen, not inherited. She had not lived anywhere deliberately in 3 years. She stood in the doorway a moment longer than she needed to. Then she stepped inside. The first thing Josephine did, before Layla had finished stabling the animals, was find the water. There was a cast-iron pot on the stove, a wooden bucket near the door, and a hand pump mounted to a short pipe that ran through the cabin's back wall, down to a spring Layla had tapped into the mountain's own hidden water table. She worked the handle until the water ran clear and cold, then set the pot on the stove over the coals he had built up on his way through, and waited. She needed to be clean. Not for comfort, not for vanity, for herself. Because the soot and ash and matted hair had been armor for 3 years, and armor, worn long enough, begins to feel like skin, and she needed to remember, privately, deliberately, before anything else happened in this place, that it was not. When Layla came in from the stable, stamping snow from his boots, he found the curtain drawn across the sleeping alcove and the sound of water behind it. He hung his coat, built the fire higher, said nothing. When she emerged 20 minutes later, he had his back to her, working at the cast-iron stove with a skillet and what appeared to be dried salt pork. She had found one of his flannel shirts on the peg inside the alcove, thick red wool, enormous on her, and belted it at the waist with a strip of leather cord. Her own dress, stiff with months of accumulated grime, she had rolled into a bundle to be burned at the first opportunity. Her hair was the thing. She had unbraided it to wash it, worked through the knots with a wide-toothed comb she found in the alcove, and then simply left it loose to dry by the warmth coming through the curtain from the fire. It fell past her shoulders in long, damp waves, auburn so deep it was almost mahogany near the roots, warming to copper and amber at the ends where the firelight touched it. She stepped out from behind the curtain. Layla turned from the stove. The skillet tilted. He caught it before anything spilled, but only just, and the brief, unguarded moment of his eyes finding her face and stopping there. Not with hunger, not with presumption, but with the genuine, slightly stunned expression of a man who has just been surprised by something he was entirely unprepared for, was the most honest thing she had seen on a man's face in longer than she could remember. She had high cheekbones, sharp and clean, a jaw that was delicate but carried a firmness in it that no amount of soot had been able to disguise if you knew how to look. Her eyes, without the shadow of the bonnet, were precisely, startlingly green. Not pale green, not gray green, but the deep, saturated green of a mountain lake in full summer, clear all the way to the bottom. There was a thin scar along her left jaw, faded silver, old. It did not diminish her. It did the opposite. It gave her face the particular authority of someone who had already survived something. She was not what Josiah Crabtree had called her. She was not what anyone in that saloon had seen. She met Layla's eyes directly, her chin level, her posture straight. No hunch, no averted gaze, no performance of diminishment. Just herself. "You don't have to hide here," he said quietly. He turned back to the skillet. "Not from me." She said nothing, but she did not look away. The first week established its distances carefully. Josephine moved through the cabin with the deliberate spatial awareness of someone mapping a new territory. She noted where he kept things: the ammunition in the chest beneath the window, the medical kit on the high shelf, the spare candles in the tin box near the door. She noted his routines: up before first light, coffee from the tin pot on the stove, out to check the animals before the temperature dropped further, back by mid-morning with whatever the traps had yielded. She noted that he drank his coffee from the same tin cup every morning, always the same cup. Dented on one side, the handle repaired with a strip of rawhide wound tight and then left to cure hard. He wrapped both hands around it when the mornings were coldest, standing at the window that faced the mountain's upper ridge, looking out at the weather the way a man reads a language he has spent years learning. She began to time her own movements by his, not consciously, or so she told herself. She woke when she heard the stove door open. She was dressed and behind her curtain when he came back from the animals, which meant she was already at the table when he poured his coffee, which meant they occupied the same space in the early morning without ceremony or negotiation, which was, she noted clinically, a form of trust she had not intended to extend. She tested him, twice in the first week, deliberately. The first time, she moved his hunting knife from its customary place on the table to the windowsill, then watched from the corner of her eye to see how he responded to having something of his touched without permission. He picked it up, looked at it briefly, and returned it to the table without a word, without a glance in her direction, without any of the territorial irritation she had learned to anticipate from men who regarded the objects around them as extensions of their dominance. The second time, she asked him a question with her eyes, a long, flat look across the table that in most rooms would have been considered a challenge, and waited to see if he would fill the silence with justification or demand. He looked back at her with the same unhurried steadiness he gave the mountain weather outside the window. Then he went back to sharpening his knife. She filed both results away. The data was inconvenient. The second week, the blizzard came. It arrived without much announcement. A shift in the light, a particular pressure in the air that Layla seemed to read in the hour before it hit, because he spent that hour banking the fire deep, bringing extra wood inside and checking the latch on the stable door 3 times. When the storm finally broke over the ridge, it was not gradual. It was a wall of white sound, the wind hitting the cabin's north face with a force that vibrated in the log walls and pressed cold fingers through every gap in the chinking. They were sealed in. The world below the mountain ceased to exist. Josephine found, to her considerable unease, that she did not mind. She sat at the table, mending a tear in one of his heavy wool socks. Practical, nothing sentimental about it, a fair exchange for the food and the shelter, when she noticed the book. He had left it on the table's edge. Homer's Iliad, in Greek. She looked at it the way she had been trained not to look at things she wanted, with her peripheral vision, without turning her head, without giving the wanting away. But her eyes moved down the open page before she could stop them, the ancient words arranging themselves into sense the way they always had, as naturally as breathing, her lips forming the shapes of them silently. She had been reading Greek since she was 9 years old, her father's idea, her mother's resigned amusement. She was 3 stanzas in when he spoke. Achilles was a fool. She startled badly, the needle pricking her finger, a sharp intake of breath she couldn't suppress. Her head snapped up. The book was suddenly at arm's length, the sock back in her hands, her eyes on the middle distance, with the elaborate casualness of someone who has absolutely not been doing the thing they were just doing. His mouth moved. Not quite a smile, something smaller and more careful than that. Something that lived at the corner of his expression and did not announce itself. "You read Greek," he said. "You ride better than most cavalrymen I've known. When you sleep, you don't breathe like a woman who was born to cold floors." He leaned forward, his forearms on the table, his gray eyes steady on hers. "You were taught posture before you could walk. Who are you hiding from?" The question landed in the center of the room and stayed there. Her hands went still on the wool, her knuckles whitened, one slow degree at a time. She looked at the table. She looked at the fire. She looked at the door. She counted exits. Front door, 1, bolted against the blizzard. Window, 2, packed with snow to the sill. Back wall, nothing. She stood up. She crossed to the curtain and pulled it shut behind her with a sharp, final sound. She stood on the other side of it in the dark, her back against the log wall, her heart doing something she refused to name. He did not follow. He did not call after her. She heard him exhale, long, slow, the sound of a man cursing himself quietly for pushing too hard. Then the creak of his chair, the soft clink of the tin cup set back on the stove. She stood in the dark for a long time. The blizzard pressed against the cabin walls, the fire spoke low and steadily on the other side of the curtain. She was not afraid of him. That, she realized in the dark, was precisely the problem. 3 weeks later, on a morning so clear and cold that the light off the snowpack was almost painful, she woke before him for the first time. She did not examine why she did what she did next. She simply did it. She built the fire up from the coals. She set the tin pot on the stove. She waited until the coffee was ready, and then she poured it into his cup, the dented one with the rawhide-wrapped handle, and set it on the edge of the table closest to the window where he always stood. She went back behind her curtain. She heard him come in from the cold a few minutes later, the stomp of his boots, the shrug of his coat onto the peg. A pause, a long one. Then the soft sound of the cup being lifted. The quiet of a man standing at a window, both hands wrapped around something warm, looking out at a mountain he had spent years learning to read. She sat on her cot behind the curtain and looked at her own hands. They were steady. She could not decide if that was a good sign or a warning. Outside, half a mile down the south ridge, a raven lifted off a snow-covered pine and wheeled east toward the valley, and far below in the white silence, 3 riders in long canvas dusters were moving north along the base of the mountain. Moving with purpose, moving in the particular, systematic way of men who are not lost. She had stopped counting exits. She noticed it 3 days before the riders arrived. The precise moment she realized she had walked into the main room that morning without first assessing the window latch, without noting the position of Layla's rifle by the door, without running the automatic calculation of distance and obstacle that had governed every room she had entered for 3 years. She noticed it, and then she stood very still in the middle of the cabin floor and made herself do it again, deliberately, from the beginning. Window latched. Rifle accessible. Door, 1 bolt, solid oak, opens inward. The data was the same as always, but the instinct that had produced it was no longer automatic. Something had loosened in her without her permission. She did not like that. She went back to the stove and stirred the pot and said nothing, which was still the thing she was best at. Layla saw the riders on a Tuesday. He had gone out to the ridgeline to track elk. The herd had moved south with the last storm front, and he needed to locate them before the next system came through and buried the lower trails completely. He had his brass spyglass in his coat pocket, a habit from the war that he had never managed to leave behind, and when he paused on the upper shelf to glass the valley below, he found them immediately. 3 men, heavy horses, canvas dusters, dark, lever-action rifles across their saddles, carried with the particular casual readiness of men for whom a rifle is not a tool, but a statement. They were not miners. They were not trappers. They were moving along the old hunting trails with a systematic patience that Layla recognized the way he recognized avalanche weather. Not from what it announced, but from what it withheld. He was back at the cabin in 40 minutes, moving fast. He came through the door without ceremony. "Pack your bag," he said. "We have company on the South Ridge. 3 men, heavily armed. They move like Pinkertons." Josephine turned from the stove. The color left her face so completely and so quickly that for a moment she looked like the ash-covered girl from the saloon, diminished, cornered, stripped of everything the mountain weeks had given back to her. Then something shifted behind her eyes. Not fear, recognition. "They are not Pinkertons," she said. Her voice, when it finally came, clear, melodic, carrying the clipped vowels of high Boston society, stopped Layla's hand on his rifle the way a wall stops a man running in the dark. He turned slowly. She was standing in the center of the cabin, her spine straight, her green eyes blazing with something that was equal parts terror and fury, and the particular exhaustion of a person who has been carrying an enormous weight alone for a very long time, and has finally, simply, run out of mountain to cross before setting it down. "Josephine," he said, her name in his mouth for the first time, though he did not yet know it was her name. "Who are they?" She reached into the bodice of the flannel shirt. She pulled out a folded piece of thick parchment sealed in wax, creased along lines that had been folded and unfolded many times in the dark. She held it out to him. "My name is not Hattie," she said. "My name is Josephine Whitmore. My father was Elias Whitmore, mining engineer, surveyor, and the only man in the Colorado Territory who was right about everything and lived long enough to prove it and short enough to never benefit from it." Her voice did not waver. "Those men work for Cornelius Sterling, and what I am holding is the deed to the largest untapped silver vein in North America." Layla looked at the parchment. He looked at her face. Outside, the wind moved across the ridge in a long, low moan. "Sterling," he said quietly. Every man west of the Mississippi knew that name. Cornelius Sterling, silver baron, political architect, a man who owned judges the way other men owned horses, who had built an empire not from the ground up, but from the law down, purchasing the mechanisms of justice one county at a time, until the difference between what was legal and what Sterling wanted had become, in most of the territory, functionally identical. He was not a violent man by reputation. He was something worse. He was a reasonable one. "Tell me everything," Layla said. "From the beginning." She told him. She told him about her father's survey work in the Roaring Fork Valley, the careful, obsessive years of geological mapping that everyone in Denver had dismissed as the eccentric fixation of a man too educated for his own practicality. She told him about the vein, the silver Goliath, her father had called it, half as a joke and half with the reverence of a man who understood exactly what he had found. She told him about Sterling, how her father had needed capital, the land rights, the equipment, the legal filings that would have to be done quietly to avoid attracting the kind of attention that transformed discoveries into wars. How Sterling had presented himself as a reasonable man, a measured man, a man of contracts and due process, who smiled across dinner tables and spoke of partnership with the warm fluency of someone who had spent years perfecting the performance of trustworthiness. Her voice hardened when she reached the estate in Denver. The dinner invitation. The signed agreement pending final deed transfer. Her father, her mother, her older brother Thomas arriving in their best clothes, carrying 3 years of work in a leather satchel. She had been in the library. She had been reading. She heard the first shot and thought, for one absurd second, that something had fallen. Then the second shot. Then she understood, and she went out the window. She had been running ever since. Layla sat across the table from her, his coffee untouched, his face very still in the way faces go still when a man is working hard to keep his reaction from becoming the loudest thing in the room. "Cobb," he said. "The man leading those riders. Deacon Cobb. He's Sterling's primary regulator. He doesn't leave loose ends." "I know who he is," Josephine said flatly. "I've been ahead of him for 14 months. "You've been ahead of him dressed as a mute beggar." "It worked." "Until Leadville." "Until Leadville," she agreed. A silence opened between them. Not the careful silence of the early weeks, the measured, strategic quiet of two people maintaining their distances. This was something rawer than that. This was the silence of a shared problem settling its full weight onto a table between two people who have just, without quite deciding to, become something to each other. Layla stood up. He went to the weapon's chest and began checking his rifle with the methodical focus of a man organizing his thoughts through his hands. "Sterling owns the law in this territory," he said. "County sheriffs, the assay offices, 2 of the 3 district judges in Denver. The federal bench is the only thing he hasn't managed to purchase, and that's only because Judge Hallett is the kind of man who considers corruption a personal insult." "Hallett," Josephine said, something shifting in her expression. "My father mentioned him once. Said he was the last honest man between the Missouri River and the Pacific coast." "He's not far wrong."
"Then we need to reach him. We need to survive the next 4 hours first." He said it without drama, without raising his voice, simply a fact offered plainly in the manner of a man calibrating for what is actual rather than what is feared. Josephine looked at the deed in her hands. She had carried it through 3 Denver winters, through mining camps and saloons, and one particularly terrible month in a Leadville boarding house where the walls were so thin she had slept sitting up with the ivory knife in her hand. She had kept it dry in river crossings, and hidden it in flour sacks, and sewn it into the lining of the carpet bag, and then removed it again because she needed to be able to reach it in under 4 seconds. She had bled for this piece of paper. Her family had died for it. She folded it carefully along its existing creases and held it against her chest. "They will not stop," she said. "Even if we reach Hallett, even if Sterling is arrested." His syndicate has 20 men in Denver alone and interests in 6 other territories. He will send more people. "Then we end it properly," Layla said. "Not just the men on the ridge, Sterling himself." She looked at him. He was standing at the window now, watching the lower trail through the gap in the shutter, his rifle in his hands. The morning light came through at an angle and caught the gray in his beard and the scar that ran through his left eyebrow that she had never asked about and he had never explained. He had said "we," not "I will handle it," not "you stay here." "We." She observed that, filed it, tried with her usual precision to assign it its appropriate weight and nothing more. She found she could not. There is a particular kind of evil, that is more dangerous than cruelty. It is the evil that dresses in reason, that comes to your door with contracts instead of weapons, with arguments instead of threats, with a handshake extended so warmly that you reach for it before you have finished reading the face behind it. Cornelius Sterling had never pulled a trigger in his life. He had simply created conditions in which other men pulled triggers on his behalf and called it commerce. Ask yourself honestly tonight, not about silver barons or frontier law, but about your own life, your own world. We all believe we can identify the dangerous ones, but can you recognize the reasonable monster? The one who makes sense, sentence by sentence, right up until the moment the door closes behind you? And if you had found yourself, as Josephine's father did, trusting the wrong reasonable man, what would you have done differently? What would you do now? They came at midday, not from the south ridge where Layla had first spotted them, but from the north, a detail that told him everything he needed to know about Deacon Cobb. The man had read the mountain well enough to understand that a direct approach up the primary trail would be visible from the cabin's front window for a full 20 minutes before arrival, so he had split his approach, sent one man up the south as a distraction, and brought himself and the remaining rider around the long way through the timber. Layla had anticipated this. He had been a cavalry captain. He understood flanking. He heard them before he saw them. The particular sound of horses moving through deep snow, the irregular rhythm of animals picking their way carefully rather than moving with confidence, which meant Cobb knew the terrain well enough to be cautious, but not well enough to be certain. There was a difference. Layla knew this mountain. Cobb only knew where it was. The knock on the cabin door,
When it came, was 3 heavy strikes of a rifle butt against the oak. Not a request, a declaration. Layla was already standing to the left of the door, his back against the log wall, the Winchester held at his chest. He looked at Josephine across the room. She was at the table, the deed in her hands, her green eyes steady and watchful. He had pressed one of his spare Colt revolvers into her hands 20 minutes ago. She had checked the cylinder without being asked, confirmed the load, and set it on the table beside her right hand with the particular unhurried competence of someone who had been paying attention. She gave him a single, small nod. He unbolted the door and opened it. Deacon Cobb stood on the porch in the flat white mountain light, his bulk filling the doorframe, his heavy canvas duster dusted with snow from the timber crossing. He was not a tall man, but he was broad in the way of something built for endurance rather than speed, thick through the chest and shoulders, a jaw like a shovel blade, small, pale eyes that moved across the interior of the cabin with the quick, systematic inventory of a professional. His shotgun was not raised. That was the first thing Layla noted. It was in his right hand, muzzle down, hanging at his side with the deceptive casualness of a man who wants you to think he hasn't decided yet. He had decided before he knocked. "Boone?" Cobb said. His voice was flat and reasonable, the voice of a man conducting business. "I'm not here to cause difficulty. I'm here to collect what Mr. Sterling's lawyers have determined is his legally recorded property." His pale eyes found Josephine at the table. "The young woman, and whatever documentation she is carrying, constitute assets of the Sterling Silver Consortium under a disputed deed filing in the Denver District Court. I have the paperwork." He reached into his duster with his left hand and produced a folded document, held it out toward Layla. "I'd invite you to read it yourself," Cobb continued pleasantly. "Mr. Sterling anticipated this situation and prepared accordingly. The Whitmore claim was legally transferred to the consortium 14 months ago. Any deed the young woman is holding is a forgery.
A federal crime, Mr. Boone. You'd be harboring a criminal." Layla did not take the paper. He looked at Cobb's face. He had seen this face before. Not this specific man, but this specific face. Men who wore reasonableness the way other men wore armor, who understood that a calm voice and a legal document created a particular kind of paralysis in their opponents, a moment of doubt that a fast man could walk through before it closed. "Those lawyers," Layla said quietly, "they work out of Denver?" "They do." "Sterling's offices?" "The consortium's legal department, yes." "So Sterling's lawyers filed Sterling's paperwork in Sterling's courthouse with Sterling's judges?" Layla tilted his head slightly. "You understand why I'm not reaching for that document." Something moved behind Cobb's pale eyes. Not anger. Recalibration. "Mr. Boone," he said, his tone shifting by one precise degree. Still reasonable, but with something beneath it now. Something with weight. "You are a man who came to this mountain to be left alone. I respect that. Mr. Sterling respects that. Hand over the girl and the deed, and you have my personal assurance that no one will trouble you on this mountain again. Ever. You have my word on that." "Your word," Layla said. "My word." The word of the man who murdered 3 people in a Denver parlor. The reasonableness left Cobb's face. Not explosively. It simply withdrew, the way warmth leaves a room when a door opens in winter. And what remained underneath was considerably colder and considerably more honest. "That is an accusation without evidence," Cobb said. "I have the evidence," the voice came from the table. Cobb's head turned. Josephine was on her feet. She was not the ash-covered girl from the Silver Dollar Saloon. She was not the cautious, watchful woman who had spent 3 weeks measuring the distance between herself and every person in this cabin. She was standing at the full height of everything she actually was. Spine straight, chin level, green eyes burning with a clarity that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with the particular, devastating composure of someone who has decided, finally and completely, that they are done being careful. In her right hand, the Colt revolver. In her left, held above the flame of the kerosene lamp on the table, the deed. The corner of the parchment had already begun to brown. "Your journal, Mr. Cobb," she said, her voice carrying the full, resonant authority of a woman who had been taught to speak to rooms before she was taught to read them. "The one you kept in your inside coat pocket. Payment records, dates, names. Your handwriting, witnessed and dated across 14 months of employment under Cornelius Sterling." She let the corner of the deed drop 1 centimeter closer to the flame. "I copied every page the night we spent in the Glacier Cave. The original is already on its way to Judge Hallett's clerk in Denver." Cobb went very still. "You're lying," he said. "I have been lying successfully for 3 years to men considerably more perceptive than you," Josephine said. "Twitch your finger on that shotgun. Take 1 step across that threshold, and this deed becomes ash in 4 seconds. You can return to Cornelius Sterling and explain to him that you lost his billion-dollar silver claim because you underestimated a woman you thought was mute." The silence that followed had a physical quality to it, dense and pressurized, like the air before a lightning strike. Cobb's eyes moved from the deed to the flame to Layla's rifle to Josephine's face. He was calculating. Layla was calculating faster. He saw the moment Cobb's attention fixed on the burning corner of the parchment, the flicker of naked greed crossing the mercenary's face, the muzzle of the shotgun beginning to lift by the precise degree of a man who has decided that speed can solve what reason cannot. That degree was all Layla needed. He did not fire the Winchester. The acoustic risk in the confined space was too great. A shot that missed could ricochet off the stone fireplace in any direction, and Josephine was directly behind Cobb's line of fire. He dropped the rifle to his side and drew the Bowie knife from his belt in one continuous arc, the heavy blade spinning once through the cold air and burying itself to the hilt in Cobb's right shoulder. Cobb's roar shook the cabin walls. The shotgun discharged into the porch ceiling, the deafening blast blowing a crater in the pine planks above their heads and sending a shower of splinters across the snow. Layla was through the doorway before the echo finished. He hit Cobb with his full weight, both men crashing off the porch into the deep snow of the yard, grappling in the white silence of the mountain. Cobb was injured, but not finished. He was the kind of man injury made more dangerous, the kind that fights better when the outcome is clear because he stops managing and simply commits. He got a hand around Layla's throat. Layla broke it loose. Cobb drove a knee into the gunshot wound from the glacier, the old wound still not fully closed, and the pain that detonated through Layla's side was white and absolute and briefly took the edges of the world. From the porch, a sharp, clear voice cut through the cold. "Cobb, look at me!" Cobb looked up. Josephine stood on the porch steps, the Colt leveled in both hands, her feet planted at shoulder width, her aim steady in a way that had nothing to do with rage and everything to do with decision. She had made the decision before she picked up the gun. That was what steadied her hands. She was not fighting to survive. She was fighting for the man in the snow below her, which was, she understood in that crystalline, unrepeatable moment, an entirely different thing. It required nothing of fear. It required only clarity. "It's over," she said. Her voice did not shake. "The second rider surrendered to the federal marshal we telegraphed from the mining camp 2 days ago. You are the last one. Put your hands where I can see them." Cobb looked at her face. He saw what was there. He put his hands up. True strength is not what a person does when they are fighting for their own life. Anyone can fight for themselves when the alternative is oblivion. True strength is the thing that moves in a person when they stop calculating their own survival, long enough to step in front of someone else's. Josephine Whitmore had spent 3 years fighting to stay alive. This was the first time she had fought for someone other than herself. And the difference, the profound, irreversible difference between those two kinds of fighting, was written clearly in the steadiness of her hands. She had not known she was capable of it. Now she could not unknow it. They brought Cobb down the mountain, bound and silent, tied across the back of his own horse. The second rider, a young man barely past 20, hired out of a Leadville saloon for the promise of easy money, had indeed surrendered to the federal deputy they had telegraphed from a mining camp relay station 2 days prior, when Josephine had slipped out before dawn while Layla was checking the animals, and composed a message in the careful, precise language of someone who had grown up watching her father write legal correspondence. She had not told Layla she had sent it. He had found out when the deputy arrived. He had looked at her for a long moment across the snowy yard. She had looked back without apology. Something in his expression had shifted. Not displeasure, the opposite of displeasure. The expression of a man recalibrating, not downward but upward, reassessing the scope of what was standing in front of him. He had said nothing. He did not need to. Denver took 3 days to reach. Judge Hallett's chambers took 4 minutes to change everything. Cornelius Sterling, who had been sitting in those chambers drinking imported bourbon and discussing the upcoming territorial election with the confident ease of a man who has never once sat in a room where the outcome was not already arranged in his favor, looked at Josephine Whitmore walking through the door and understood, in the fraction of a second before his face composed itself, that the arrangement had changed. The deed. Cobb's journal. A federal deputy's signed testimony. Sterling's lawyers argued for 6 minutes before Hallett silenced them with a single raised hand. The marshals came. Sterling went. Josephine stood in the doorway of the emptied chambers afterward, watching the street below where the Silver Baron's carriage sat unmanned, his matched gray horses standing patient and indifferent in the cold. 3 years of running, condensed now into the particular stillness of something that is finally, completely stopped. She felt Layla move to stand beside her. He did not touch her. He simply stood there, large and solid and present, in the manner of someone who understands that proximity, offered without demand, is its own kind of language. "It's done," she said. "It's done," he agreed. She exhaled. It was a long breath, longer than any single breath should reasonably be, as though she had been holding it in pieces across 3 years and was only now releasing the last of it. They did not stay in Denver. Josephine met with Hallett's clerk to begin the formal process of reinstating the Whitmore deed. She retained a lawyer, one she selected herself from a short list she compiled in 2 hours using criteria she did not share with anyone. She made 3 financial arrangements that would take several months to finalize. Then she packed her carpet bag. She found Layla at the livery stable, saddling Buster with the quiet efficiency of a man who has been in cities long enough and is ready to stop. "The lawyers will handle the rest," she said. He looked at her over the roan's back. "You sure?" "The mountain will handle the rest of me," she said. "The lawyers can manage the paperwork." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. The same small, careful thing she had first seen by firelight weeks ago when she had been caught reading Homer and pretending she hadn't been. She had stopped pretending a great many things since then. The cabin was exactly as they had left it. Cold through, the banked coals long dead, the windows opaque with frost on the inside. The tin pot on the stove, the rocking chair at its precise angle to the fire. The curtain across the sleeping alcove, still drawn from the morning they had fled through the back window, with rifles and pemmican and no certainty of return. Layla built the fire. Josephine unpacked. When the cabin had warmed enough to remove their coats, she went to the stove and filled the tin pot. She moved through the familiar geometry of the small kitchen, the flour barrel, the salt box, the dried herbs hanging from the low beam, with the unhurried ease of someone in a space that has become, without announcement, their own. She was reaching for the coffee tin when she saw it. The cup. His cup. Dented, the handle wrapped in rawhide, cured hard, sitting on the shelf exactly where it always sat. She had looked at that cup every morning for weeks, had measured her own changing relationship to this place by how naturally her hand moved toward it. She took it down. She filled it. She set it on the edge of the table, in the place by the window where he always stood to read the morning weather off the upper ridge. Then she poured her own cup and sat down at the table and waited. He came in from seeing to the animals a few minutes later, snow on his shoulders, cold coming off him in waves. He hung his coat. He turned toward the stove. He saw the cup. He was still for a moment. Then he crossed to the window, picked it up, and wrapped both hands around it the way he always did, and looked out at the mountain in the early dark, the ridgeline barely visible against the last of the light, the snow on the upper faces catching the final blue of the evening sky. "Josephine," he said quietly, still looking at the mountain. "Yes?" "You're safe here." She looked at her own hands around her cup, the aristocratic fingers, the old calluses from the carpet bag strap, the new ones from the axe handle and the trap lines, the faint white scar on her left jaw that caught the firelight when she turned her head. She thought of the girl who had counted exits in the Silver Dollar Saloon. She thought of the morning she had first poured his coffee and gone back behind her curtain and sat listening to the silence of a man who never once demanded she fill it. "I know," she said. It was the simplest true thing she had said in 3 years. He turned from the window then. He crossed the room and sat down across the table from her, and they drank their coffee in the firelight without speaking, the wind moving across the ridge outside in the long, low voice of a mountain that has seen everything and forgiven most of it. After a while, he reached across the table. He set his hand over hers. She looked at it. She turned her hand over, slowly, and laced her fingers through his. Outside, the first snow of the new season had begun to fall. The fire spoke low and steadily. The mountain held them both. Whether love like this, built from silence and survival, and the long work of learning to trust what the hands do before the mind catches up, whether it is enough to hold against everything the world below the snowline will eventually send back up the trail. That is not a question the mountain answers. That is the question you carry back down with you. Home is not a place on a map. It is not a deed filed in a federal courthouse, or a name restored to a legal record, or a fortune recovered from the hands of men who believed that ownership and theft were simply different words for the same transaction. Home is the specific gravity of a room where someone has, without being asked, already poured your coffee. Home is the person who makes space for you without requiring you to shrink into it. Josephine Whitmore had spent 3 years running toward survival. She had not known, until a mountain man laid down a royal flush in a smoke-filled saloon and offered a hand she refused to take, that what she had actually been running toward was this: a fire, a table, a cup of coffee poured in the dark before the words were ready. Every time I read your comments, I am reminded of something I used to forget: that stories are not really about the people inside them. They are about the people listening. Josephine Whitmore survived 3 years of silence, not because she was fearless, but because she refused, quietly, stubbornly, at great personal cost, to let the world's cruelty become her own. She carried a deed and an ivory knife, and the memory of a family she could not save, and she kept moving. Most of us are carrying something like that. Not a silver deed, not a hired gun on our trail, but something. A version of ourselves we have been hiding beneath ash and a ragged bonnet, waiting for a room safe enough to finally set it down. I hope you find that room. I hope, if you haven't yet, you are still on the trail toward it. And if tonight you are somewhere in the middle, not at the saloon anymore, not yet at the cabin, know that the mountain man is still riding ahead. Not too fast, just enough to break the trail. Right now, as the fire settles and the story finds its end, where in the world are you listening from? Drop your city below.
I read every single one, and every single one matters more than you know. If you still believe that the right person, in the right moment, can change the entire direction of a life, stay close. The next story is already waiting for you, and it was written with your heart in mind.